Excuse me, sir. I think you're bleeding.
Someone much smarter than me once said, if you have the ability to make holes, you should also have the ability to patch up those holes. I personally think that every responsible gun owner should also have a first aid in their kit. Before we talk more about the contents of the first aid kit, let's talk about where you should have your first aid kit for the range. What we do in our shooting club is that we have individual first aid kit that every shooter has with them. We think the ideal position is on your shooting belt. It's always on your body. Personally, I really like the pull-out med kits. I'm not a medical professional and this is not a tutorial. If we grossly simplify, we have 3 different traumatic injuries and 3 different tools that we can use to make you survive, to stop the bleeding. For injuries on your extremities, on your limbs, we use a tourniquet. It stops the blood flow and essentially stops you from leaking out of your limbs. For the injuries on the other parts of your body that are bleeding, but you cannot solve that with a tourniquet, we use wound packing. So we use a gauze, or we use a special kind of clotting gauze, or in the past they used even clotting powders. But the idea here is to pack as much material as possible in the wound, put pressure on it and then bandage it. But be careful, we do not wound pack the abdominal area or your lungs. If you get shot in the upper chest area, you will have a hole in your chest and possibly in your lungs. For that, we used a chest seal. Essentially, you just seal up the entry and the exit hole so you can still continue to breathe to a certain degree. You can also improvise and use different kind of things to achieve the same result. But be very careful, because some improvised methods are more effective than others. For example, to close up a sucking chest wound, you can use tape, duct tape, even a plastic bag. It will actually work very effective. Ah, pičku mater! Ah! To pack wounds, you can use other cotton materials like a bandage here, or even if you don't have anything else, you can use your cotton t-shirt. Now, of course, that's not ideal, but if you have nothing else, it will work. And here we have a tampon. Tampons are super controversial in this area of first aid. Some people claim that tampons can be used instead of a proper gauze to kind of fill in and close a gunshot wound. Now this is so controversial because apparently tampons were actually invented in First World War and they were first meant to actually close bullet hole wounds. The reality is that there is some truth on both sides. Now, yes, you actually can use tampons as a packing material for a wound, but you will need a lot of them. Just one tampon will do nothing, because if you want to properly stop the bleeding, you will have to pack a lot of material in the wound and constantly keep pressure on it. But please, don't be stupid and don't use tampons as your main solution in your first aid kit. They do not work well. And you have so many better alternatives. The packing gauze is super cheap. And that should be your primary solution. A belt instead of a tourniquet. I still see this mentioned on the internet, and in my personal experience, it doesn't work. I only was able to make it work one time in training, and it was a very thin belt. Yeah, sure, you can tighten the belt around a limb, but then it's really hard to apply the proper pressure to stop the circulation. And if you can't do that, it's just a belt around your limb. It's not a tourniquet. In the past, they used the scarf. Yes, you can actually make a very effective tourniquet from this, but the question is, do you have time? What if you shot yourself in one of the arms? Can you make it with one arm? Can you make it in under a minute before you bleed out or pass out? Again, if you don't have anything else, a DIY anything will be better than nothing. But do not rely on these things. Why would you save some money, a couple of dollars, that could cost you your life? And the gloves, latex or even better nitrile gloves, they are essentially for your safety. These are not sterile and they don't have to be. You usually put them on because you don't know the person that you are treating and what are their conditions or maybe illnesses. So that's for your safety. I personally think that some people worry too much about stuff being sterile, or for example the expiration date is past due. But when someone gets shot or stabbed, there's also already foreign objects and dirt and bacteria in the wound, and your main goal is not to try to keep that wound sterile, because it's not anymore. Your essential goal is to stop the bleeding and keep the person alive. If he gets infected later on in the hospital, great, because first that means that he survived, and second thing, that's not your problem anymore, that's the hospital's problem. With gunshot wounds, don't forget that besides the entry, you can also have the exit hole. But as always, there are two sides to the story. Please check on your medical equipment to see that it did not deteriorate and that it's still good to go. Or if you use special products like the clotting gauze, you have to know that this has an expiration date, because probably the clotting agent will not work past certain years. But essentially it will still work as a normal gauze. Tourniquets. We use them to stop bleeding from the limbs. You put it above the wound, you cinch down, and you stop circulation in the limb. That also stops the bleeding. Now there are many different models on the market and they work in a bit different ways, but essentially I think the industry standard is the cat tourniquet. There are better and worse options on the market, but keep in mind that even the worst functioning tourniquet that you can have is better than bleeding out and dying. But be careful, please do not buy fake cat tourniquets, because I think the vast majority are made in China, and all of them that we have tried do not work. They maybe look the same, but when you try to apply it with a proper force to stop bleeding in your leg, it will break the windlass, it will tear the stitches, or the material will break. Now it's kind of sad that I have to mention this, but judging from the comments from our previous content on this topic, is that some people still do not know that tourniquets are safe to use. There's a ton of data, theoretical and practical research done on the topic. Essentially, you can put a tourniquet on your limb, even if your limb is completely fine, and you can cinch it down to stop complete circulation, and you can have it on your limb up to 2 hours without any serious nerve or muscle or any other tissue damage. It's smart to have a tourniquet readily available somewhere on your gear, but please don't use zip ties to attach it, because it may cost you your life. Also, have the tourniquet prepped so it's ready for one-handed use. There are two schools of thought here. Now the problem with the first one is that arteries are elastic, and if the artery is completely severed, it can be actually pulled a bit up to the body, and when you apply the tourniquet, the artery may be bleeding internally above the tourniquet. And with the high and tight method, it's really hard to go wrong, because you just put the tourniquet as high as possible and you stop complete circulation in the whole leg. But as we discussed, you can do this for 2 hours without any danger of tissue damage or nerve damage or actually losing the limb. So you should not be scared of applying the tourniquet. There are two options. I can slide it over, or I can open it up and put it under. Now here is the important part. You have to check that there's nothing in the pocket, because this will obstruct the functioning of the tourniquet and the person can bleed out. And the second, for males, it is actually kind of important that you check that there's no genitalia caught in the tourniquet, because first, that will hurt as a motherfucker, and second, you can lose a piece. A lot of people fail this step. When you have the tourniquet positioned, you have to already tighten it with quite some force, because the windlass itself will only apply pressure if the tourniquet is already tight on the limb. Now there are some guidelines that say that you should turn the windlass at least 3 times. Essentially, you turn the windlass until the bleeding completely stops, and I would still do 1 or 2 rotations extra. It's almost impossible to tighten this too much, but it's possible to not tighten it enough and the person can still bleed internally. Oh fuck. And yes, if you apply the tourniquet properly, it will hurt it will hurt a lot. You use this strap to secure the windlass, and then if you're in a combat area, you can write the time of the application of tourniquet here. You can still write the time even in a civilian application, but it's not that necessary. You write the time of the application on a tourniquet, so when the casualty arrives at the ER or the operating room, they know for how long you have the tourniquet applied, because if it's longer than 2 hours, there are special procedures that they have to do before they release it.
Why?
Why? Because after a certain time, the blood and the cells in your leg will start to die off, and it creates toxins, and if they restore the circulation, I think you get into a shock or some like that's not my specific area of knowledge, but it's bad. That's all you have to know. Oh fuck, it did stop the circulation in my leg. Oh. Now, some of the best tourniquets on the market, they're also used by military forces, have the TCCC approval. That's the Tactical Casualty Combat Care. They test the tourniquets and they evaluate different factors like the ease of use, the durability, the effectiveness, one-handed application, and so on. This may be a bit controversial, but I personally do not believe that every tourniquet needs a TCCC rating to be effective. And for many years I'm using tourniquets that were not TCCC approved. For example, the Rats tourniquet. So why I still use this? Because it's cheap, small, and light. I actually have 4 or 5 of these. One is in my car, one is in my backpack, one is in my plate carrier. These are not the only tourniquets that I use, but they are so cheap and readily available that I just bought a couple of them and put them in places where I might need them. Also, if you have to take a tourniquet with you and carry it on your person, you will see that a bigger tourniquet is actually very inconvenient to carry everywhere. And it's better to have a worse performing tourniquet on you than an amazing tourniquet at home when you need it. But why is this not TCCC approved, and why it's not recommended to use for any serious combat use? Because this tourniquet is too narrow. That means that it's really hard to create 1.5 inch of compressed area to stop the bleeding without causing damage to the tissue. And also this tourniquet is a bit tricky to apply with one hand. But on the other side, you can apply it to very small children or, for example, to dogs effectively. Now, I think you saw the potential problem with application of this tourniquet. And imagine if I had dirty hands or maybe blood on my hands, or if I would be shot in one arm, it'll be really hard to apply. Now, these tourniquets are very effective and they can stop circulation even in very thick ties in your legs. Right now, my leg is actually killing me. It hurts so much. But there's another problem. For a civilian application where an EMTs will be here in 15 minutes, maybe even less in Slovenia, not a problem at all. If I have to have this on my leg for 2 hours, I will create a lot of damage. The problem is here. If you can see, the tissue gets compressed between these strands of elastic, and this is where you create a lot of nerve and tissue damage. Oh fuck! This is the best tourniquet that I have ever used. The Dnipro tourniquet, made in Ukraine. This is the Gen 2 version, and essentially it works in the same way as the cat tourniquet. I still think that the cat tourniquet is one of the best options you could get in the US because it's readily available, it's light, and it's very cheap. But for us poor Europeans, the price of the cat tourniquet is more than twice as much, and it's sometimes really hard to get. So we found this alternative and found out that it's actually improved in many areas. Works completely the same as the cat tourniquet, but it has a steel buckle and it has an aluminum windlass. It's almost indestructible. Now, let's be honest, this is tougher than the majority of users will ever need in their lives. But think about why it's good that it has metal hardware and that it's so overbuilt. Plastic can deteriorate because of the UV, because of the heat, because of the chemicals, and when you need the tourniquet, maybe you have it mounted on your gear for 10 years, and then when you apply it, it can break. So if you want 100% certainty and reliability, you go with something that will last you a lifetime.